We good? Okay, 1 second. Okay, good morning, everybody joining us online. We're trying to figure out our audio. It might just take a moment. All right, just testing that. No, what did we do before? We turn it off here. No, it was in here. Is this? Which one? Top one? This one? No. All right, I think we figured it out. Good morning again. My name is Dr. Wood Roberdeau, and I teach in the subject of visual cultures in the School of Art at Goldsmiths. And I want to welcome you guys to the 2025 Festival for the Association of Art Historians. We're very excited at Goldsmiths and Visual Cultures to be participating this week amongst many other fabulous events around the nation. So you can see here on the screen um, what we are planning to offer. Here we are today with Paradise Lost. This afternoon, my colleague Sam McAuliffe will be giving another lecture to do with landscape entitled Demarcations at 2 p.m. In the cinema here and online. And then on Wednesday, my colleague Dr. Lenka Verblikova will be giving a very kind of unique uh, walking tour around the campus that is a learning collaboration with fungi. So don't miss that. And then also on Wednesday afternoon, we have the Labyrinth as Recollective Landscape. Take Your Body on an Ancient Journey at Albion Millennium Green, which will be led by Professor Emeritus Urella Andrews. And it's a really kind of also unique experience that's very meditative and very centering. And Urella is an expert in phenomenological experience, and so it's not to be missed. Friday the 19th, Dr. Jana Graham will be leading a tour of Deptford entitled River Logistics, Plantation Imaginaries, Desedimenting Deptford. And that will be starting off at the Deptford Lounge and is also well worth attending as it's part of a larger research project going on here at Goldsmiths. So what am I going to present today? I thought, because universities are still in clearing, and because I'm the program leader for the BA of Art History in the department, that I would pitch a lecture that's developed from our undergraduate material. So it should be fairly accessible, but I'll go at a pace that I hope everybody's happy with, and it should be about an hour long. So I've entitled the lecture Paradise Lost. Uh, because a lot of my work has to do with introducing histories of art to histories of eco-criticism. And just to maybe give you a context for the complexity of those histories, we could look at several different eco-critical camps in order to kind of accept the diversity of perspectives when we're talking about global issues and contemporary urgencies like climate crisis or ecological degradation. So the first camp we might call cornucopianism. This is a camp that takes the view that technology and growth will be able to meet and correct environmental crises. Then we have environmentalism, which is perhaps the one that everyone's most familiar with, in which the non-human environment has to be maintained so the human environment can prosper, um, which is kind of deceptively anthropocentric when you think about it, despite the cause. Deep ecology insists on retrieving a monistic ecosphere between the human and the non-human, and this is a kind of ultimate goal to restore a balance to relations. And then we have the perspective of social ecology, or what's also referred to sometimes as eco-Marxism, which argues that environmental problems come from systems of domination or exploitation of humans, but by other humans. So if there's a water shortage, it's not necessarily a resource problem alone. It's usually involved or tied to political unrest or injustice. And then finally, queer ecology, which is a kind of substrate of ecofeminism. And this is a camp that considers the question of human versus nature as a kind of dyad that becomes extended historically through the other dyad that is gendered of man versus woman. And the introduction of more than human fluidities becomes a kind of objective for this particular eco-critical camp. So what I'm going to try to do today is take you through several different centuries and several different, maybe canonical works, but also introduce some more contemporary works that maybe raise questions through these five camps in order to destabilize what has become a kind of, in the West at least, rift between nature and culture. So, in that sense, we can start broadly by thinking of what we might think of as a recovery narrative. Is there a kind of paradigm that sits maybe alongside a cornucopianist view or an environmentalist view or a deep ecological view? Um, and this recovery of holistic nature, this investment in the ideology of repair, is something that we're now starting to question and to um, explore alternatives for. So in that sense, we might think of a recovery narrative alongside the alongside understanding the ramifications of what that might mean for colonialist histories and empire. How does that kind of recovery go along with conquering? So just to start simply, the main model we could maybe turn to for the recovery narrative is, of course, the Garden of Eden. So this is an image by Athanasius Kircher, Topographia Paradisi Terrestris from 1765. And I show it to you to kind of get a sense of the etymology and the origin points for thinking this paradise, which we're so concerned with losing. Paradise, loosely, in the Old Persian, means around that which is built out of the earth. So Diza of paradise, Diza is meant to be a fort or an enclosure. So automatically and kind of crucially, you have the establishment of an interior and an exterior, or a dialectic of civilization and wilderness. Now, with this, jumping ahead into the 21st century and thinking about critiques of that paradigm or that kind of fundamental model that we don't always look at critically, we might turn to the work of ecofeminist Carolyn Merchant. In her 2004 book entitled Reinventing Eden, she argues that the fall of Adam and Eve within Christian doctrine merged with concepts of scientific truth. The quest for paradise, as a spiritual and political motivation, was the image projected by the European colonialist of the New World. So the worldview was that human labor would redeem the souls of men and women, while cultivation and domestication would redeem the earthly wilderness. In other words, actual environmental upheavals in the world were based on the religious notion of parousia, or the reunification of the earth with God. So again, a return to Eden or a paradise regained. Considering the force called civilization, if we think about that in maybe modern terms, it becomes interesting to look for connections to these kinds of pre-Christian interpretations that we sometimes forget about. Plato's influence, for instance, and the argument for ideal natural forms beyond the cultural realm of their representation is one example. So you might think about the allegory of Plato's cave and how reality is never accessible within the worldly realm. Moving towards the secular enlightenment of Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and René Descartes, one could chart an origin story for capitalism that performs an exodus from the desert wilderness into the promised land of mechanistic science and industry, tools that will serve to rebuild that garden that we lost. So this brings us maybe to a kind of almost mythological detour of sorts. How can we, from this perspective, begin to understand that nature and culture do make up a dialectic within a broadly defined Western consciousness, even today? So for Merchant, she breaks this down quite directly and in detail by looking at the two figures you can see here, who are, of course, Adam and Eve, the first humans. Um, After the expulsion from the garden, Merchant writes, the fallen Adam becomes the inventor, the necessary inventor, the unavoidable inventor of techne, or skill, craft, art, which leads to, of course, our understanding of technology. This was a desperate situation after being expelled, to then have to be responsible for labor, such as agriculture. The fallen Eve becomes a figure for that nature which must be subdued. For Merchant, this duality within the Edenic recovery story presents to us three dialectical forms of nature. The original Adam in the garden, in paradise, becomes or is known as God's image on earth, the Creator's image on earth. The original Eve, before expulsion in the garden, becomes the image of the Virgin and the image or the symbol for potential development. The fallen Adam, as I said, expelled, is the one charged with the redemption of that lost paradise, whereas the fallen Eve, who was expelled for her sin, becomes symbolic of the birth of wilderness or chaotic nature. The father Adam, once settled with children, once they do reproduce, becomes a symbol of law and patriarchy, whereas the mother Eve, once settled at family, becomes a kind of figure for the concept of nurturing. So you can kind of see this kind of pressure of or responsibility that dogmatically has been placed on the human species to repair that which was um, irrevocably damaged. And so from the allegorical, we have a very clear preconception of humankind's place within the more than human world. It's hierarchical more than anything else. Jumping ahead to the 16th century, we might look at another allegorical scene, this time by Piero di Cosimo, entitled The Discovery of Honey by Bacchus. Piero di Cosimo painted this allegorical scene also uh, in the 16th century, as I said, known as one of his secular paintings. It depicts a divine episode, but one intentionally presented at the human register of everyday life or the quotidian. So you can see a central tree trunk there. And this trunk, of course, contains bees and their honey, but it also divides the panel in two. So in the background, you might notice that those with honey on the left find themselves before an ordered and sunlit city, while those without, on the right, are left in the darkness and uncertainty of forest and ruin. Honey is therefore depicted as a civilizing force that unites the realm of unbridled nature with that of mankind. This conclusion lends the painting its art historical weight as symptomatic of Enlightenment thinking and confirms a place for it in a culture that exists outside of nature. So for today, we might think about the forest here as a metaphor for the edge of Western thought, the edge of rationality, the wilderness, which we've just seen in many ways has historically been feminized, which is also why ecofeminism is such an important eco-critical camp to consider when analyzing works of art like this. And as I've hinted, for from classical philosophy, or Plato and Aristotle, to medieval creationism, to global technoscientific civilization, Western thought has been founded on objectifying modes of knowledge, on productivist metaphysics. So this is also famously argued by Adorno and Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School, whose dialectic of enlightenment allowed their concept of second nature to emerge. If um, we think of a second nature as capitalism or even petrocapitalism, um, or capitalist accumulation as something that has become a kind of second law of nature, which also then is able to help us understand and underpin what we mean by anthropocentrism, and then the very bedrock for anthropocentrism, which is the new geological epoch of the Anthropocene. Um, when anthropos, or humankind, and its actions have become inextricable from eco-crises on a planetary scale. And I'll say more about that later because there are some kind of complexities that need to be addressed when we refer to that new epoch. Um, but thinking about this ordering of nature through culture, we might also begin to think about questions of scale and measurement. So this is an image or a picture of organized nature as extending over the earth by Charles S. Smith. And you can see perhaps that superimposed on the mountains is a series of lines that represent latitude from a 0 to 90-degree north and south. Crossing the latitude lines are straight lines of varying thickness, which show the appearance on Earth of flora and fauna at various latitudes. The snowfall line is also shown. On the central axis, elevations from 0 to 27,000 feet are listed. So the point I'm trying to make here by showing you such a diagram, or graph or map even, is to emphasize that the concept of nature as a totality, but also a measurable totality, um, is one that humans begin to address and conceive as able to be taxonomized, able to be classified, able to be complete, archived, and known. And that, as we'll see, is very problematic when we're thinking about contemporary eco-critical thought. But it does take us to some maybe more accessible examples of how that mentality has been operational in visual culture for so long. For example, we might think about Rudolf Arnheim's categories for garden aesthetics, or criteria rather for garden aesthetics, if we're thinking of gardening as a form of cultivation by design. So Arnheim was a 20th century professor of the psychology of art, which is a kind of interesting field, or Gestalt psychology, thinking about the psychoanalytical implications of environment for an individual. Um, this work was carried out at Harvard, if you're interested. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the essay he wrote called Order and Complexity in Landscape Design. So these are the four categories that he establishes for thinking about the motivations behind landscape design, or garden design more specifically. Questions of homogeneity, coordination, hierarchy, and accident are all kind of interwoven into histories of gardening culture. And he looks at those traditions within the West, but also the East, and tries to coordinate, different case studies based on these four coordinates. But I'm just going to give you a definition from him on what he considered to be order and what he considered to be complexity, and why they are intertwined within landscape design. So order, he writes, may be defined as the degree and kind of lawfulness governing the relations among the parts of an entity. Such lawfulness or obedience to controlling principles derives from the overall theme or structure to which the behavior of all parts must conform. It also applies to the makeup of each part within itself. So what he's really describing there is a natural order that designers are trying to access and somehow um, uh, appropriate, perhaps, or reproduce within their work. Complexity, on the other hand, is the multiplicity of the relationships among the parts of an entity. By multiplicity, I do not mean quantity. A pattern may consist of many parts connected by many relations and yet be quite simple, as in, for example, a formal rose garden. So he goes on to explore these kind of relations between order and complexity by um, giving quite well-known examples. This one I've pulled just from the South London Gallery Garden by Gabriel Orozco, that kind of you can see looks at these maybe questions indirectly by searching for patterns and repetition, homogeneity, coordination, hierarchy, as if to have been arrived at by accident. But Arnheim himself looks to more historical examples. So you have the plans here of Versailles and Paris in 1789, where he emphasizes the kind of overbearing aspect of order as one of those criterion. And with that, you have this kind of royal claim to be able to control and fully design an ordered, mathematically ordered kind of gridic environment as a kind of way of um, owning nature. And then he also looks to the East and Japan and thinks about Japanese garden design, also ordered, but intentionally with the aim to uh, make it seem as though it is natural or accidental. So there's a lot of attention given to placement of things, which is highly ordered, but the end result is to feel as though you're happening upon something that occurred naturally. And then also just from the kind of flagging image of the lecture for today, Peter Zumthor's design for the Serpentine Pavilion in 2011. And I'm not going to say much about this other than the Serpentine Pavilions are annual constructs, and they're meant to be meeting places and places for various other cultural activity. And this year, Zumthor, to my mind, almost has replicated that image that we began with of paradise or paradisa, where you have this fort or enclosure around a kind of um, uh, precious garden in the center. So now that we've seen some spatial implementations and modern constructions of the ordering or the design of nature, we can introduce the question of romanticism in art history and what that kind of means for the discussion today. And to do so, to begin with, I think it would be helpful to look at two paintings by Nicolas Poussin and review a bit, for those of you that have read him, Immanuel Kant and his claims and critique of judgment. So these two works were completed by Poussin over a 2-year period, and they help us to grasp maybe Kant's principles or faculties of the beautiful versus the sublime. Theorist Louis Marin has analyzed them as being illustrative of these faculties. So he writes that both paintings take as their subject the same landscape, and that's hopefully apparent. You can see that this is the same scene, just from different angles. In the first, we have a very direct, balanced, and still composition, while in the second, the town seems to be actively approached as atmospheric movement picks up. So for Marin, the calm before the storm suggests Kant's sense of the beautiful, and the storm itself as the chaotic sublime that is the other side of beauty. In the second painting, therefore, nature is presented more crudely, and the experience of viewing this version of the landscape ruptures the framework of the first beautiful composition. So it confirms an instability to the natural world that it's depicting. So in other words, the threat of the storm about to break transports the viewer to that liminal site of anticipation, terror, awe, viscerality, as does our being drawn through the same view toward the altered object of our attention, because you look at these together as a pair. The scene as an ordered whole has been fragmented and disrupted by a different, uncontainable energy. Uh, Moreover, it's this fragmentation of the terrible totality that makes it palatable. Something I'm sure will also be explored maybe this afternoon when Sam talks about demarcation in landscape. But for Kant, it's such a space, a fixed point of spectatorship that allows the sublime to be conceived by us as viewers. Once anchored, we can test the limits of aesthetic experience and be reminded of the ways in which we cope with the inexpressible. So in other words, you need a kind of economy of distance to be able to grasp sublimity. And so this kind of view of nature begins to be accepted and pursued well within to the 19th century, and uh, many Romanticist paintings that involve nature that come out of that. Also picturesque paintings that look at ruins and kind of wilderness scenes as another way to consider these faculties. Quintessentially, we have this painting by Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea and Fog, um, which is kind of emblematic of this set of relations I'm trying to describe, where you have this um, lone figure staring out over the vastness of that object to be measured, that is nature. The quotation is from a poem by Friedrich Hölderlin uh, about the philosopher Empedocles, who famously hurled himself into a volcano once he realized the vastness of nature and the kind of um, positioning of humans within that concept. So, on behalf of Empedocles, Hölderlin writes, and when I often sat on still mountain heights and astonished, reflected upon the changing, insane fortunes of man, too deeply captivated by earth's transformations and sensed my own withering near, then the ether breathed to me, as to you, in healing fashion, around my lovesick heart, like cloudy smoke. So there is this kind of um, magical tension, perhaps, between the kind of lone figure in the wilderness and the awe that it inspires, and what that might mean for thinking mortality, but also philosophically thinking kind of the human mind as something that is hierarchically more advanced than anything else more than human. So with that, we could think also about in the 19th century figures like William Wordsworth and John Ruskin in this country, and figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau in the New World, uh, who consider themselves and their work to be in opposition to the political economy and rapidly expanding industry of their time. So significantly for us, in the 1990s, their works were revisited under the banner of romantic ecology, one that would support that monistic ecosphere, that kind of aim of total balance that was espoused by the deep ecology movement in the 1970s. However, this contemporary remobilization of modernist claims for nature also points to something lost that must be recovered, to something that can be recovered. This is more in line with that camp of environmentalism and its investment in human agency or responsible custodianship. So, with any romantic revival, there is a confirmation of subjective fragmentation. So, again, culture versus nature, division of labor, rationality versus phenomenology, the written word versus oral traditions, and the list goes on. Early environmentalism deployed a concept of nature as a moral and psychic norm that would combat the industrial argument or the cornucopianist argument. So, for romantic ecologists, society becomes a kind of category for not surprisingly, individualism and reckless ambition, whereas nature becomes a model for moral and stable unity. So nature is defined or invoked in order to make, strangely almost, a political argument. Um, and the way that that was often accomplished was by introducing or reintroducing images like this to a kind of political or activist context. So this has been alleged to be Britain's most popular painting of all time. I can't remember where I found that, but I did read that somewhere. And I wondered why. And I thought then maybe like for romantic ecologists, the metaphorical language of poetry is something that can transgress the rigid literal demarcations between one thing and the other. So you have this kind of presentation of an idyllic or morally unified way of life or everyday where there is a kind of balance between um, this pastoral scene, these dwellers of this site and the landscape beyond, and therefore also becomes almost kind of emblematic of Britishness itself. And I'm not going to go into that now, but uh, that takes us to some of these thinkers that I mentioned and their kind of fundamental views that are then pulled into these eco-critical camps and perspectives and agendas. So we'll start with Emerson. And Emerson famously wrote an essay simply called Nature um, in 1836. And in this essay, he established a groundwork for uh, what's called transcendentalism, a belief system that advocates an alternative admiration for nature. Uh, so what that means, basically, transcendentalists believe that the divine or the godly pervades nature and suggests that reality can be understood by studying nature. So the idea of being at one with nature, I would say, is a very Emersonian stance. For example, in the essay, thinking about this, if you think back to the Caspar David Friedrich painting, being a lone figure in the wilderness or in nature, um, allows him to exclaim that I am a transparent eyeball. I see all. So the subjective begins to uh, reduce, and this sense of a unified whole or a transcendental move becomes experienceable or comprehensible. But moving back to, well, just to say, thinking of the notion of natural beauty after Kant, with Emerson, you have these three kind of transcendentalist principles. The simple perception of natural forms is all that you need to attend to because they will come to you. The presence of a higher element or the godly as being graspable through nature or beauty, and the objectification of the world by the intellect as something that perhaps challenges